Wild Goose, would you welcome Ruby Sales, please?
We call that Southern hospitality. Thank you.
Ruby and I have talked a couple of times about what we would do, and then we talked this morning. And what we talked about this morning was let's don't talk about what we're going to do because we want to do it in front of you. And she and I talked a little bit, and this is a little unusual for me. I'm normally not on programming. But as we talked, she said...
I made him.
She did. I want you to understand that. But if I were going to cheat the system and like president gets to pick somewhere, this would be where I would pick to be. But Ruby finally said, Jeff, you've been wiggling out of this ever since we started. Shut up. She said, yeah, she says, I think we vibe and we maybe know some stuff that some young people don't know yet. So... do you want to take it off?
Well, I just want to say, I want to begin this morning by making what some people might call a news commentary, but I'd like to put it in perspective for the 21st century capitalist technocratic state where very few lives matter. This morning, for those of you who saw the press conference that Trump held in the UK, it bore all of the racist marks of what he's been spouting in this country. And I think it's really important for us to understand that in addition to laying down mandates for trade, he was also encouraging Germany and England to engage in ethnic cleansing.
Yes.
You've got to understand that. The real question is the Eurasian project, envisioned by a Russian named Alexander Dubin, that imagines that Russia will control Europe and certain countries in Asia. And those countries are the countries that we've seen Donald Trump become very friendly with, and that the whole purpose is to destroy American influence in Europe, Brexit, his performance at NATO, his misogynistic assault on Theresa May and Angela Merkel. It's really important for us to understand that they are engaged in a project to rid Europe in a growing Islamic and colored world of populations that are not indigenously European. That is the common knot that binds them together. So as we move forward this afternoon, I think it's very important to expand our 20th century mind into a 21st century context that understands that we're not living in an industrialized society anymore, that we're moving toward a technocratic state. There are no more inner cities, basically, because gentrification has gutted them. So when you talk about inner cities, you're talking in the 20th century reality. You need to talk about rural sites of desolation, where people are being pushed into rural sites of desolation, which I believe will be the battleground for human and civil rights in the 21st century. So that's the context in which I'd like to challenge you to expand your mind to the 21st century.
That's a pretty broad context. This didn't just happen last night. It didn't happen in November of 2016. This has been happening for a long, long, long time, right, Ruby?
Yes.
And let's share some of the things about where this comes from, the roots. We are where we are because we were where we were, and we ended up where we were headed, is kind of what's happened here. And for folks to think that there was some sort of a blip or somebody sort of the rails got a little bit offline and we dropped over to this side, this has been a trajectory that's been going pretty consistent and persistently, at least since
1400s with the doctrine of discovery. And I think that it's really important for us to understand what the pervasive themes have been that have been essential to a spiritual malform and a social perverse project of white supremacy, misogyny, and all of its tributaries in the society. America's economic and culture system is a system that's built on plundering and stealing. Whether it's stealing bodies and holding bodies in captivity and commodifying bodies to fuel an economic system, whether it's captivity, commodification, dehumanization, vilification, fragmentation, state-sanctioned rape and pedophilia, and state-sanctioned violence and mob terrorism. Those are what I call the sins of the American and Western empire. And no matter what system you go to, these weapons of war exist. And within the construct of this world, people of color are enemy combatants who pose a threat to the efficacy of white supremacy, that our rights, our mobility, and our ability to speak in the fullness of our voices pose a threat to white male supremacy. And to a small degree, so do women. And so do LGBTQ people. And so that this is what we are up against. And so whether you're talking about the Trail of Tears, whether you're talking about Wounded Knee, whether you're talking about concentration camps and sites of terror called reservations, whether you're talking about sites of terror during enslavement called plantations, whether you're talking about sites of terror that I grew up in the Southern Apartheid South, they were sites of terror. The South was a site of terror for Black people. So we've got to begin to really understand that what we're trying to do here is not to engage in transactional movements where we ask for rights to open the door so that a few more elites can get in the door. Because unless you change the very heart of the system, as Martin Luther King said, unless we move from being a thing-oriented society to a people-oriented society, unless we engage in a movement of transcendentalism, we end up reproducing the very systems that we stood against. And so it's really important for us to understand that the movements that we're engaged in are first and foremost movements of consciousness, movements that raises our level of consciousness. And so in raising our level of consciousness, we create and articulate a common question. And for those of us today, and then I'll get to the history, but I really want to say this, I'll get to the history later. But for those of us today, the pervasive question within all of those weapons of war that I just named is, to whom do our bodies belong? Do they belong to the state? Do they belong to us? And do they belong to God? And the second part is, to whom does creation belong? Does it belong to us? Does it belong to God? Or does it belong to the state? And whether you are dealing with Marxism or whether you're dealing with liberalism, they end up just disagreeing about where the power should belong. Marxism says that it should belong to the state. And what democracies say is that it should belong to the majority. And when the majority is white, then that says that it should belong to white people. And so that we are really called upon to really look deeply into how we construct our movements for the 21st century. They must be movements that move us to a higher level of consciousness, that changes how we live with each other, God, and all aspects of creation. They must provide us with pathways of redemption that move us out of the moral nihilism and provides each of us a clear passage straight to a beloved community.
Pretty good summation there. Sets it up really well. So the question that we've asked ourselves, I'd like for us to take a minute and go into the conversation about a focus on the individual as opposed to as a focus on the group.
Yes. Well, you and I talked about it, that even in radical circles, people say, tell me your story. And although they think that's radical, it really reproduces how the official story gets constructed around individuals rather than, as Howard Zinn says, around people. So my story is not my story without a context. First of all, I began with a collective story, and I find my place in that collective story, that I do not position my story, as a narrative without a context, a narrative that is not in relationship to other people. And so that I think that we've got to really, even when we think that we are being progressive and radical, we've been so socialized, as Marcuse would argue, into the status quo, that if we are not involved in transcendental movements where we question the very essence of who we are and how we exist in the world, we can only recreate that which we know. That's why revolutions that start out, militarized revolutions that start out calling for liberation, oftentimes ends up being repressive ones, because they were seeing freedom and imagining access to freedom in the same way that empires had maintained their power through militarism and violence and repression.
So one of the ways I think we implement that's around vocabulary.
Yes.
You know, we tend to use. I know I'm a post-evangelical, and most of the language we would use in my church would be very much like a militarized language. You know, we were warriors. We were going to triumph. It was about victory. It very much reinforced that whole system. And if I'm hearing you correctly, what you're saying is that when we win, we actually don't win because we've lost a chance to really change. We've mostly just rearranged the chairs and sat down to wait to get back in the same place we were.
Yes, and what people who think that they are being liberal, what they say is that the answer to the question is to let a few black people in, a few women in, to go across the glass ceiling so that they can become white men.
Yeah.
And so what Martin Luther King reminds us, that our work is not to integrate into a burning house. This is a great gift. This is what I tell my nieces and nephews who complain about what their mamas didn't do right when they were growing up. I say, look, your mama had your life for 18 years. But one of the great acts of grace is that adulthood gives us the opportunity to make right, which we had no control of when we were children. And that's the same thing with once you come into a liberating consciousness, it's a grace-filled moment, a redemption to set right that which you were not able to do when you were bound by oppression and was blind and could not see.
Go on.
So rather than being a burden, it's a great opportunity because basically what it says, thanks be to God, that we are not entrapped by our histories. That we are not entrapped by our histories. That we can create a new story, new stories, and new relationships. And the great secret that the empire does not want you to know is that they need us much more than we ever needed them.
Yeah. So
And we must believe that.
So what's that going to look like? How would we turn that over? If we own that they need us more than we need them, what would we actually begin to do as a group and as individuals?
Well, I think one of the things that we must do is interrogate our assumptions about ourselves, others, and creation. How is it that we see animals? How is it that we see other human beings? How is it that for example, when you study mainline Protestant religion during the Reformation, one of the things several things strike me is that although it was really a movement for individual piety, it did not make a connection between individual piety and collective piety. And although it was displeased with the Roman Empire, with the papacy, it was not displeased with empire. And so the societies that grew up were charitable societies that were designed to make more people more comfortable within an oppressive system that the people never really wanted to change. And that idea of Christianity as charity, as maintaining the status quo, as connecting itself with the projects of empire, form the very heart of empire Christianity today. And it was present during enslavement. It was present when churches stood on the side of misogyny. It was present when churches ranted and raved that people who were LGBTQ were going to hell. So we see it, and even those of us who have been victimized by that kind of spew, the paradoxical and almost a sad thing is that we become both victims and predators simultaneously.
You know, the distinction, the comments you made, looking back, that they were unhappy with the church, but not unhappy with empire. Now,
Right.
A lot of us in here have studied the Protestant Reformation, and we have some conception on it. And I think that's a really striking comment that you make there, because I think that's what Ruby is saying here. We don't need to repeat that same mistake, because what really happened there was they sort of changed a few things, but they kept the infrastructure, they kept the system, the empire in place. And as a matter of fact, the aspiration of the change was to basically take over the empire. And so,
Or to certainly have a seat at the table.
seat at the table. Yeah. So is the answer that's like, are we asking for a seat at the table, or are we wanting to turn over tables?
Well, I think that in a society that is overwhelmingly materialistic, that sees the good life in the materialization of power, that if that's your value system, it's logical that your movements will be transactional. Give me more jobs, give me more houses. And although I certainly think people should have decent housing, the transcendental question would be, what is the greed and the disparity and the spiritual malformation that make people take everything and leave other people with very little?
So how do you achieve some transactional outcomes without becoming subservient to transactionalism? In other words, you just said, Ruby, that I'm not against more jobs, and a lot of us maybe in policy advocacy are trying to find more jobs, more opportunities, and things like that. At what point does the seeking of that basically become us just simply?
When you allow people to hijack your movements and turn around and provide their language to describe the people's struggle, which is what happened in the Southern Freedom Movement. The Southern Freedom Movement was more than a movement for civil rights. when you're in a society and you can't even go to the bathroom and drink the water, that's a movement for human dignity. That's a movement that not only relieved the burden and the perversity of Southern apartheid off of the backs of black people, but it was a redemptive movement that provided white people a view straight to the kingdom of God. And so it was in many ways a very high moment in white history that people don't understand what it meant to break with a culture. It was a high moment in Southern history for white women to appear on a public street with a black man to march in a demonstration where historically that would have been an absolute event that would have led to rape. It was a transcendental moment when a black woman ended up in close proximity with a white man who didn't try to rape her, who saw her as a colleague and not as his concubine. That was a high moment in transcendental history. And it was when white people came into the movement, of course they brought the socialization, just like I brought my elite attitudes into the movement. I had to challenge my elitism. But the thing about the movement that was different is that we all came not as teachers, not as leaders. We came to learn from ordinary farmers and sharecroppers. We came to understand, they were the ones who articulated, and for the first time in history, had the public microphone. And we came there to be their students, not to believe that our college degrees from Tuskegee or Morehouse, Empire degrees gave us the right to lead a people. And white people came wanting to learn from sharecroppers and ordinary people. And we were willing to be there in community as residents and not as conquering heroes. Because when you do that, when you say, I'm going to organize a community, that's really problematic. Because implicit in that statement is that a community is an empty vessel, and that the community has existed in chaos. And you, the conquering hero, you, the missionary, is coming to organize these barbaric, chaotic people and to bring light to their dark worlds.
Yeah.
We have got to really rethink how we engage with people. We've got to really understand that had it not been for ordinary folk movements, folk music, folk culture, we would all be swallowing in the abyss of hell. And so it's really important for us to really move away from our elitism, move away from our vision of what struggle is. And the other thing that I think is very important is that we must develop a new language for the 21st century. And let me tell you why. In the 20th century, the right-wing Southern strategy, as they were gathering forces, they stole liberation language. And they called death squads liberating squads. They called things like the Freedom Caucus. They took liberal language of democracy and radical language and applied it to very oppressive and violent actions by the state and the group who was trying to maintain white supremacy. So if the Freedom Caucus is a Freedom Caucus, what the hell does that word mean anymore? And so we have to really begin to create a new language that really begins to name, for example, these are not foster children, they are stolen children. They're not in foster homes, they're in sites of terror. They're not in loving situations. They are commodities where some countries make $450 million off of their bodies. That is the same thing that happened during enslavement. This is nothing new. The stealing and the fragmentation and the dehumanization of children is not new. I know that story. I descend from that story. That story still lingers in the spiritual and grief DNA of my people. I grew up not understanding the depth of that grief, but it was there. People don't get over that because you then reunite them with their families. That grief stays in the human psyche and in the collective consciousness. It is an act of sheer barbarity. So when you go out and donate money to the Cayuga Center and all those sites of sinners, all those sinners, and think that you're helping people, you're really putting a veneer of respectability and legitimacy on the site of terror, which is a 21st century site of enslavement. So we have got to start. You can't, people say, okay, we're going to do this. How are you going to help people when you're still calling that place a foster care? I mean, really, that distance yourself from their suffering. It distances yourself from their pain. It distances yourself from the political reality. Don't you think so,
Oh,
Jeff?
absolutely.
And why do you think so?
Well, first of all, I feel really inadequate to speak right at this moment. And I mean that
No,
with,
you're
with
not.
deep
Come on, tell
sincerity.
us.
No, I'm serious. I feel a need to let that soak a minute. Can we just do that? Just, yeah.
I want to say something to break up this silence, because what my mother would say to me when I would try to wiggle out of something, and she would say to me, if it's painful for you to hear my voice, how do you think it has been for me to feel what you've done? And so if people can endure the suffering every day, Jeff, we must endure the telling. We must endure that. We cannot protect ourselves from that which people endure every day. We cannot, movements don't coddle us. They tenderize our hearts, they bring tears, but they allow us to put on our marching shoes and become audacious and courageous.
Yeah.
We do not coddle each other in movements, because that is the way in which the system has kept us really bound up in a womb-like stage where we feel like if we come out in the world and be on our own, we won't survive. And they give us these little benefits that coddle us. And so that we have got to not do movements, please. And I didn't mean to break through that silence, but I had to say that. Because if children can endure being separated from their parents, we must endure hearing about it without breaking down. I like you. A lot of amens over there. Tell me your name.
Zach Mills.
Okay, Zach Mills. Good. It's called a response with you. I feel like I'm in a Baptist church. Right.
So, for me, I feel really, I don't know what to do. I'm made my life about doing. I generally have some response, something to move, something to do, something there, and I don't even know where to start. And I hate to say
Yes,
that.
I know you keep trying to make me be in motion. And what I'm saying to you, sometimes the best thing that we can do is to stop for a moment and sit still and think. And think deeply, deepen as Vincent Harding would say. By the way, my friend Jackie Lewis, are you in the house?
Yes. Yeah. Jackie.
Okay, Jack and I are going to be developing the Vincent Harding and Rosemary Harding Center for Social and Spiritual Restoration.
Yes.
And Jackie and I are going to be inviting you to Middle Collegiate Church to have classes so that we can exactly work to this goal of what to do. But before we decide what to do, we have to know what it is why is it that we need to do something, right? And what does it mean to live in a 21st century world? What is different about now than yesterday? and what is the same, and how might we begin to think about the things that we did well in the 20th century, and when I was at EDS, they would say our growing edges, and what are our growing edges? And so that this requires us to develop a liberating praxis that includes critical analysis, spiritual reflection, action, and education.
I'd like to drill down a little bit on the new vocabulary.
Okay, great.
Because I think vocabulary is the means by which we form our narrative.
Yes.
And there's a little bit of a cycle in it, and the narrative sort of. So do we start in terms of the new vocabulary by beginning to list those words that ought to retire, or should we do like we every year they'll tell us what new words were invented
There
this
is
year?
no monolithic way to do that, because if you're a person of color, your list might be very different than a white person's
Yeah.
list. If you're a woman, your list might be very different from a man's list. And basically what we have to do is not insist that even in movements, we have to make room for the particularities as well as universality. And so that there is no monolithic list. I mean, there are universal things that would go on all of our lists, right? But there are particular things that would go on the list of people who are economically dispossessed, people who are sexually dispossessed. So, and so that's part of what the empire says, is that we must erase our particularities to get to this great experiment called universality. And what I'm proposing is that we must move away from erasing people's reality. So the first word that I would ask people to really look at is this, when people say Trump's base. That really drives me crazy, because it put on the backs of black and brown people something we're not guilty of. It implies, it doesn't name that it's a white nationalist base, and it allows them to really obscure the brutal and dehumanizing nature of their theology and their ideology. And it almost implies that his base is a diverse base composed of all people. And once again, it gives black people something that's not ours to own. And so the first word that we must, and immigrants, stop saying immigrants. It's black and brown immigrants. It's black and brown migrants, because there's 60,000 undocumented Irish people in this country, and they're not being hunted down and put in jail and their children taken away from them. So language is very important, because when we say immigrants, we really are speaking not with the mouthpiece of the people, but we're speaking for the empire, who want us to believe that we live in a post-racial and a post-gender world. And so that we've got to really begin, and when we say white privilege, that's another word that I think that we really need to look at. If you understand that whiteness is spiritual malformation that distorts one's relationship with God, others, and all aspects of humanity, and requires those people who come from European ethnicities to commit historical suicide by severing their roots with their families and their grandparents' struggle, and to forget when they were once strangers at the gate of the empire, and all of the ways in which the empire brutalized them and sent them to the front line to fight in nationalistic wars that yielded them very few benefits when they got home. That when you separate yourself from that history and choose a history, there's something really suicidal to become the very people who are the parents of your pain. And so that is not a privilege, that's an existential death. And so that we've got to start, and when black elites do that and walk away from our history and engage in the white project, that's not progress, that's death. And so I think that we've got to understand that we do not want white privilege. It is bankrupt. What we like to have are human and civil rights. so that everyone has the same rights and the same opportunities to live into the fullness of their goodness and potential as human beings. That is the ideal. And to be able to move freely in society without the constraints of violence and containment. That is the ideal.
I think,
And let me just say something. And I think that that sounds very hard for people, and people think, wow. But actually, if you can get to what I'm saying on a very deep level, it liberates you. And black people have a song, and I'm going to share it with you. When you have to go into the wilderness. You know the story about Jesus going into the wilderness? Well, we've learned that story in a very Empire way. But Jesus knew that he would be no use for anybody unless he confronted the empire in himself and began to wrestle with the need to be famous and all of the hubris, the spiritual and social impediments that stand in our way of building a beloved community. So our journey, we're not fit to help anyone unless we understand that we too must go in the wilderness. And that when you come out the wilderness, there's a liberating feeling. You're not perfect because the devil said, I'm going to let him go right now. But what that implies is that the struggle is a constant struggle. And so that black people used to say, tell me, how did you feel when you come out the wilderness? Tell me, how did you feel when you come out the wilderness? Did you feel like loving everybody when you come out the wilderness? Did you feel like running when you come out the wilderness? Did your feet feel brand new? And your heart did too when you come out the wilderness. So when we do the work of our own, dealing with our inner lives, and understand that who we are in the inside really affects what we produce on the outside. It's not about going out in the world and saving anybody. People are capable of saving themselves. What it is for all of us to believe in the goodness, in the capacity of people to reach that goodness, even when they don't believe they're capable of doing it themselves. This is what we're after. It's not to condemn, it's not to go and think that we're better than them because James Baldwin is right. They might be white supremacists, but you might be a misogynist, and I might be an elitist, and we all have a master in us. And so the question is, how do we develop a righteous movement that does not negotiate on the question of oppression, but has plenty of good room for everybody to be redeemed?
Since we're in the month of July, I'd like to talk about a word I think we ought to, if not retire, at least think about.
Okay, what's that?
Independence.
Oh, yes.
Independence. Like, it's become the case that it seems that the highest form of living is to become independent. And then we celebrate it in our movies. We celebrate it in our 4th of July holidays. And in fact, we use it to justify just about any kind of an activity we want on a national basis, whether it's economic war or militarized war. Because if something threatens our independence, the way we understand and interpret independence, it allows us to do anything we need to do or want to do to hold on to sustain and extend our independence. Because independence is our thing, and it's where we're headed, and it's what we're supposed to have. And so I like to substitute the word independence with interdependence, and that the highest form is interdependence. But here's what's going on. I think a part of the political fruition is this. If I'm a professor, and if you were to come to my office, across the bottom shelf are a row of books by Ayn Rand.
Oh, wow.
Ayn Rand's books are on my shelf, and when I notice a student seeing them, I say, you need to understand that I don't like her. They're not there because I'm advocating it, and it gives me a chance. I walk over and I say, do you know the name of the book that Ayn Rand wrote on ethics? Now, some of you may not know who Ayn Rand is. Atlas Shrugged, The Fountainhead.
Yes.
The co-author of journal articles with Alan Greenspan, the sort of the epitome of individuality. The book that Ayn Rand wrote on ethics, and this is precise. If you could dig her from the grave, if you would dare try, you'd say, what was your ethics book? It's titled The Virtue of Selfishness. She said, if society is to long stand, we have to be able to stamp out altruistic tendencies. So this is why a Donald Trump, for example, can behave as Donald Trump behaves, because he reaches no higher than independence. He does not realize connectedness. And I think there's been so much harm done behind the flag of independence. And for me, that's a word I spend a lot of time thinking about. And interdependence, it's when we begin to move in that direction, there are people whose job it is, whose aspiration it is to remind us that we shouldn't go there and that the most important thing is to be independent. And Bonhoeffer referred to Jesus as a person for others. And if we oriented ourselves toward otherness, I believe the natural social structure would be around interdependence. But the trend, I think, in our system and in our society is exactly the opposite of that, and that's everything about libertarianism. So when somebody says to you, trying to have a civil conversation, says, well, I'm really a libertarian, but I usually vote Republican because we don't have any good candidates. Libertarian to Republican is not on the same continuum. These are not just a little bit different flavor of vanilla or chocolate ice cream. These are discontinuous thoughts. I'm a libertarian, basically says, I want what I want and you can go to hell. And it just doesn't matter.
And Republicans say, I'm white and I want what I want, you can go to hell.
So at least now we know who all's supposed to go to hell. That's pretty much us. So I'd like, and what I would encourage you to do, for me, I've, especially in talking with Ruby, what word should we retire?
Yeah.
I didn't feel entirely good at Independence Day this year. You know?
Who felt great? Who felt great?
I was with you. I felt great.
That's okay. Well, so I wanted to say, so I really did a lot of sitting and a lot of meditating, and you know, even now I feel this need because it's my reflex action, because I see the uniforms and the badges that my two uncles brought home from the war, and I don't want to dishonor, but on the other hand, I was like, I want to say, well, I'm a proud American, but I don't know if I'm supposed to. I don't actually feel good saying that. It's not because, this is an empire question. It's not because I'm not proud of America now. The question is whether or not I want to define myself in that term. If that means that I am this and therefore I'm not that, and somehow the other, I must be, the other disease, exceptional.
Well, I think that we are all faced with the dilemma that we can't cut ourselves up and not be Americans. So the question is, how do we be Americans? What does it mean? And America does not have a monolithic history. It has what Vincent Harding calls rivers. There is a river, there's a stream, there are tributaries in American history. So the question is to identify those streams and to make a conscious decision about which one you're going to travel on. And because the truth of the matter is, nothing is all bad and nothing is all good.
Yeah.
And if I'm creating a movement that make people feel so badly about themselves, then I'm just doing what white people tried to do to me. And so that's not a good movement. But it is a movement that people have to make a conscious choice to locate the goodness in themselves as well as the goodness in other people. And that's not easy, because sometimes I scream so loudly at the television and I want to just strangle people and cuss them out and say all kinds of vile things to them. But, you know, we pull ourselves back and we take a deep breath, right? And we understand that one of the things that we've learned by people putting their feet on our necks is that we don't want to ever do to anyone what has been done to us. Not even those people whom we think have done it to us.
Yeah.
Because the minute that we act like them, we become them, and everything that we create will be theirs. And so that it is really, I'm calling on us to really create for the Trinity. We're in a spiritual crisis. more than being in a social crisis. The social crisis comes from the spiritual crisis. America is in a spiritual crisis. And we must begin to develop spiritual language that raises us up from disposability to essentiality in a beloved community and in a capitalist technocracy. This is our task for the 21st century. We are in a spiritual crisis that really commodifies, whether it's in the medical industrial complex, whether it's in the prison industrial complex, whether it's in the immigration industrial complexes. We are living in a society where the only relevance in a technological society that many people have is that their bodies are commodities and objects to be used by the state. And that is really what we're dealing with. And stop saying jobs programs without understanding what that means in a capitalist technocracy where technology is replacing human labor and memory. What kind of world do you create when history is essential to struggle and technocracy dismembers and says that we should dispose of our memories and give it over to computers? How are you going to have a spiritual movement with efficacy? Does history and memory matter in a technological society of virtual spaces where we do not have everyday contact with each other? We must begin to ask the question in the 21st century, what is history, and does history matter?
In Nashville, there's a school of business at a university named after a person named Jack Massey. On the day they named the Jack Massey School of Business, Jack Massey's daughter spoke, and she proudly explained that in her daddy's lifetime, he had invented 3 businesses, all using the same business model. Does anybody know the 3 businesses Jack Massey invented? Fast food. He's the person that really made Kentucky Fried Chicken launch. He was the business, but thank you, he was the business brain behind HCA, Disease for Dollars, the commodification of people ill. You know his 3rd business? Prisons for Profit. And here's what she said. And if you think about this, she said, Dad did all 3 businesses the same way. See, as a business person, what they did with Kentucky Fried Chicken is they had a revenue stream and a low cost for planting, and the revenue would keep sort of like just turning cash over, and they would throw out more chicken stores and throw out more chicken stores, and they kept on laying more chicken eggs, and they kept on throwing out more stores. And then they sat around when Medicare and Medicaid came online in the 60s, and they said, so okay, we're going to use the same model, and we've got an even better guarantee of how the system is going to get paid for. We're going to have plenty of demand for our product because folk are going to get sick. But now we got a government program that's going to underwrite it. And so they invented Disease for Dollars, and you cannot possibly tell me that you can do health care better whenever you take profit out. When you take some profit off the top, you're not going to do it better. And then the same thing. There's the thread here. Profits out of prisons. So then we are now, it's like this level of degradation almost, so that now there's a financial incentive to put someone in prison, to hold someone in prison. The same people that were teaching us, I was battling this in the political world in the 80s and the 90s. You remember everybody, and it didn't matter whether you were Republican or Democrat, you had to basically say something about 3 strikes, you're out. You know, and so we've ended up, we are the most imprisoned nation on the planet. We have the highest cost of health care per capita on the planet. And that might not be that bad if we were anywhere near the best on the planet. We generally rank somewhere around 50th in healthcare statistics. And the reason for that, in my very strongly held opinion, is that we're using the same model for prisons and hospital and fried chicken.
And what I would say about that is very important. I want to just caution everybody. I don't care if we have the best educational system in the universe. Captivity of human bodies is unacceptable.
Yes.
Period.
Yes. Period.
It is a zero tolerance. That's my zero tolerance. It is unacceptable. You can't balance out goodness with evil. You can't balance out liberation with radical oppression. You can't do that. You can't play loose with people's lives. And so that it really is important for us to begin to really, I can't say this deeply enough and loudly enough, to deepen our thoughtfulness, our thinking about the world that we live in. Let me give you an example. It's no secret to everybody that I'm a same-gender loving woman. And even in my community, we have to live into all of our identities in the world, because when white lesbians just describe themselves as lesbians, they're not living in the fullness of their identity. They're hiding a certain portion of themselves that has access to rights that a black lesbian does not have rights to. That is intellectually and spiritually dishonest. And in doing that, what you're forcing me, you're operating on a power level where you're using your power to cut out my tongue and to create a reign of tyranny that if I don't speak my lives the way you say I should speak them, then I become the angry black woman and you become the victim. And so we've got to really understand that we are called upon to live into all of our identities. I must live into my identity that as a black woman, I have access to things that many black people don't have access to. I've got to claim that. I can't lie to myself and pretend that I'm just like somebody who lives in public housing. That's a lie. I don't have to worry. I don't have children. I don't have to worry about my children being shot up in the street. And when I pretend to be just like a black mother who worries about that, I'm telling a flat-footed lie. And so it's really important for us not only to demand that other people claim their identities, but that we claim our own. We must be able to live in a world where we are able and truthful enough to claim the parts of ourselves that have been stepped on and the parts of ourselves that have benefited from oppression. And there are no monolithic communities. Even if we share, as Audre Lorde would say, our same proclivity for loving the same gender, it does not mean that we live the same lives. It's really important to stop gobbling up people's lives in one LGBTQ. I mean, come on. We must, and so that's not a problem out there. That's a problem in here. And the other thing that has really made me scream and yell at the TV is that Kavanaugh's nomination. If anybody says Roe versus Wade as the ultimate imperative that we should be struggling against, I'm going to scream. Because as a black woman, what about my body that's beyond whether or not I can have an abortion? What about my children? What about the bodies of immigrant children who are being contained in sites of terror? What about the fact that black women have the highest infant mortality rate, 4 times the rate of all other women in this country? We must begin to talk about the confluence of these oppressions and not have black women break ourselves up into parts and choose our reproductive part over our other parts. That is just really, that is repressive, that is oppressive, and it's not friendly. And the one thing I would say to my sisters, I have to say this again, each of my sisters, change the mantra of the feminist movement. You do not want to break through the glass ceiling. You want to wreck the whole fucking house.
Thank you so much, Ruby.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you so much.